Hello everyone, back to today's first video. So you're going to have a look at some analogues for the spring today, and specifically focusing on ENSO. So we did the ENSO update last night, where we had a look at what's going on in the Pacific Ocean. And essentially we have moved from a really weak La Nina at the start of the winter through to ENSO neutral, where we are right now. I'm going to continue on towards ENSO neutral as we go into the spring. So our analogues today are going to be focusing on ENSO neutral springs, either slightly positive ENSO neutral, so on the warmer side of neutral, or on the colder side of neutral. And there are a couple of years, not many of them, a couple of years that actually follow from a weak La Nina. We've got 21 springs to look at, and then at the end we'll get all of the years together and create a reanalysis chart of all of those springs, all 21. Our good friend James Acrill has produced all of this for us today. So big thank you to James. I know you'll be watching the video, James, and big thank you to you for all of your hard work. Just say later on we'll have a video looking at, well, we look at various things on a Sunday now at Gasway, so it'll be a bit of an eclectic mishmash. We'll look at the Arctic Constellation, we'll look at the North Atlantic Constellation, look at the stratosphere, we'll look at the weather next week, 10 days, and maybe a few things thrown into there as well. So that'll be with you probably around lunchtime to early afternoon. And this video is going to be placed on the Spring Updates page, by the way, with a written report that goes with it. That'll be placed on the Spring Updates and Forecast page this evening. Before I get on with the video, just say about the ads. There's links right yours on all the pages. Have a browse through widgets and click through the links. If there's any articles that you're interested in, you're helping us to pay the website. Thanks so much for doing that. There's also video ads, both pages. They open out content. And if you give those video ads a watch, you will be helping us to pay for GavsWorthies.com. So let's just start off setting the scene with ENSO. So back at the start of the winter, I talked about this last night, so I won't go on about it too much, but back at the start of the winter, we had a signature for a weak La Nina. We see that by those blue colours there through the equatorial Pacific Ocean. So we started the winter with a very weak La Nina, borderline neutral, on the cold side of neutral, to weak La Nina. The latest is that we are going rapidly now back to ENSO neutral. So we do still have a signature for La Nina here in the central part of the Pacific Ocean. Still got some cold sea surface temperature anomalies there. But over towards the Pacific side, things are quite clearly warming from where they were at the start of the winter. And this can be expected to continue through to the spring, which looks like it's going to be ENSO neutral. It's probably going to be ENSO neutral on the warmer side, if anything, rather than the colder side. So James has been trawling through the archives to come up with ENSO neutral springs, going back to 1879, can you believe? This is our first year reanalyzed, so this is the spring of 1879, and this was on the negative side of neutral, so it's kind of coming out of the La Nina. You're not sure how strong it was, but kind of coming out of the La Nina, and it's on the colder side of neutral, albeit was an ENSO neutral spring. So what we see for this spring is that we have a trough down to the south, we have a ridge up to the north and to the northwest, and the jet stream is on a southerly track there doing something like that. That was a really cold spring in 1879. Of course, I did the historic video over Christmas, on Christmas Day, looking at the whole of 1879, so we know what happened that year. It's a tremendously cold year, coldest year since 1740. And the really cold spring of 1879 made up part of that. So our first year to start us off with certainly looks like a very cold spring. And this one looks like it will be pretty cold as well. This is 1898. Again, this is on the colder side of ENSO neutral. This has lots of blocking up to the north there, and also a trough down to the south and over the UK. So again, you would have thought that's quite a cold and unsettled looking spring. I would have thought there would have been some snow coming through with that at times, especially the earlier part of the spring. Cold and blocked for the spring of 1898. We go through to our next year, which is 1901. Again, this is on the colder side of neutral, and very similar signalling in some ways, blocking up to the north, although not as strong as the last couple of years we looked at, but nevertheless still a blocky signal up to the north. Low pressure have changed the colour there. Low pressure is down to the south. So again, you'll expect this in spring 1901 to be quite a cold and quite a blocked looking spring. 1904 is our next year, and this one's a little bit different because this one actually is coming out of a weak La Nina as well. So it's not just ENSO neutral, it's also coming out of a weak La Nina. I know we've had this weak La Nina since to start the winter in the spring of 1904. So this is a closer match perhaps to the current scenario. This one looks very unsettled, deep trough out to the north and west and a real Atlantic flow came there. I don't think it would be particularly cold, but it certainly looks an unsettled spring. I'm sure would have been some gales and some bouts of heavy rain coming through there in the spring of 1904. So far, it looks like quite an unsettled signature for the spring. Next year is 1907. And again, this one looks very unsettled. I don't think, again, it's overly cold. Low pressure is out to the north and west and coming through the UK. And the jet stream's going like that. So it looks very Atlantic driven, really unsettled. Probably a lot of rain coming through with that spring in 1907. And we go on to 1913. This one, again, looks very unsettled. Look how deep that trough is through the spring of 1913. Out to the west of the country, and again the jet stream is doing something like that. So really wet spring, I would have thought, in 1913. That again on the colder side of the ENSO neutral. 1916 also looking very unsettled. So this really does look like a very unsettled signature for the spring. Actually, I'm a little bit surprised about this, but it does look like very unsettled signature so far for the spring of for the springs that we're looking at, these ENSO neutral springs. Now, this one is 1920, and this is on the more positive side of ENSO neutral. It's on the warmer side of ENSO neutral, if you will. And that could be where we're going this year, actually. I've got a feeling we'll move through the spring onto the warmer side of ENSO neutral in the Pacific Ocean. So those years we're just looking at that are on the colder side of ENSO neutral may not be the greatest match where we are right now, except for 1904, which is coming out of a weak La Nina. Now, this one in 1920 also looks unsettled, but it's less dramatic, if you like, than the previous years we've been looking at. Just a straightforward, unsettled type pattern there in 1920. Nothing overly dramatic from the reanalysis. Our next year is 1925. This, again, is on the colder side of ENSO neutral. This is another year where we're coming out of weak La Nina from the winter. So, again, this one, along with 1904, is a fairly close match. And, again, this one looks a very unsettled spring. Deep trough there, entrenched through the whole of the west of Europe, blocking out to the north and west. So we expect that to be quite a cold, maybe even quite cold at times, and very unsettled spring in 1925. 1927 is our next one. This again on the negative side of ENSO neutral. This one not quite as dramatic, but even so, it looks unsettled. Low pressure generally through the country and centre of the northeast. We've got ridging around Greenland as well. We do also have the Azores high though down to the south. So a bit of a messy spring. This one. These, we're trying to bring in southwesterly winds, but also trying to bring in northeasterly winds, I would have thought. So, quite an odd-looking spring, that one in 1927. But overall, again, probably quite an unsettled one. 1932 is our next one. Again, this is on the positive side of ENSO neutral. This one, again, looks unsettled. Look at this, trough through the west of Europe. We've got the ridging, the blocking around Greenland, and the jet stream is doing something rather like that. So cool and unsettled through the spring of 1932. Then a big gap, interestingly, a very big gap through to 1960. So, well, not quite 30 years, but almost a 30-year gap there to our next year. Again, this one is on the negative side of ENSO neutral. And what's interesting about this, it's a very different pattern to anything we've seen before. This one looks very anticyclonic, so we've got high pressure above average heights centred around Scandinavia, but also extending down into the UK as well, with the trough pinned back in the middle of the Atlantic. That looks a nice spring. That's the first one that we can really say looks like a pretty decent pattern for dry, and potentially by May anyway, fairly warmish temperatures, because we'd be bringing the air in from the east and the southeast, which of course start off with in March. That would probably be quite cold, but later on that'll be quite a warmish pattern. So that's our first year that we've seen that looks quite decent in terms of warmish and dryish weather through the spring 1960. 1965 is our next one, and we're back to what we've been generally seeing throughout these years, which is ridging out to the north and west, a trough. This time it's centred mostly through Europe. It looks like quite a cold pattern, this, for the spring of 1965. Of course, we know the 1960s was generally a cold decade with lots of poor summers, cool springs, cold winters, fair amount of snow, and also encompassing that severe winter of 1963. So that one is another year. After that better spring in 1960, we're back to cool, wet weather in 1965. 1967 is our next year. This one again on the negative side of ENSO neutral, and this one looks unsettled. Trough is up to the north of the country, a ridge is around the Azores, but quite a long way from us, so again this looks like quite an unsettled spring, and probably fairly cool as well in 1967. Fairly big gap then through to 1979, and this is following the really cold winter, of course, of 1979. Looks like a cool, wet spring going on there. The remnants really left over from that very cold winter weather pattern, with the jet stream doing something like that between the troughs and the ridges. A wet, cold spring in 1979. As we aren't having a cold winter, I think we'll probably discount these years that are showing cold and wet for the spring, because I think this year and also 1879 are just really a continuation, if you like, of the pattern that was going on through the winter. However, this is on the positive side of ENSO neutral, so could be closer to where we're going to be in 2017. Next year is 1981. This again on the negative side of ENSO neutral. So we've got low pressure running into the country like that. Notice again above average heights around Greenland. That's a fairly strong signal coming through, although it does vary year by year as to how strong those heights are. This just looks unsettled, really, quite a wet spring. And probably not overly cold, but we know we did get a very dramatic cold snap at the end of April 1981. Next year is 1984. This looks very different to anything we've seen before. This has ridging through the UK, really from the Atlantic, through the UK and going up towards Scandinavia, with a trough down to the south. You'd expect a lot of dry weather with that. I think it was a fairly dry and warm spring in 1984. Continued, of course, from, or continued into what was quite a warm summer in 1984 as well. That one looks a little bit different. It's only really that one in 1960, but as suggested, there could be a chance of ridging through this spring. Again, this one doesn't look all that bad. This is 1993. Again, this is on the positive side of ENSO neutral, interesting. So that's closer to where we are right now, perhaps, or where we're going to be by the spring. This one shows a ridge around Scandinavia and low pressure centred out in the Atlantic, rather like that. And the jet stream doing something like that. That was a fairly warm spring in 1993. I remember that quite well. The first half of 1993 was really interesting. It's a really interesting year, actually, because the first half of 1993 was warm. The second half, really from one day in July, I think around the 8th of July, or the 10th of July, when a dramatic cold front swept southwards and lowered the temperature very dramatically. And from that day on, the rest of 1993, up to December anyway, was really cold. And then December 1993 started to revert milder again. But from July through to, from January through to June, it was a very warm year. From July through to November, it was a very cold year. And then December rounded it all off, coming out close to average. But there was some snow in December 1993. It's quite a cold Christmas. So that's an interesting one, 1993, to say the least. And the spring of that year was pretty warm and fairly dry. 1996 is our next year, and this is our third and final year that is coming out of a weak La Nina. So this is ENSO neutral spring, albeit on the colder side of ENSO neutral, but the connection with where we are now is that it's coming out of a weak La Nina winter. And this one was a cold spring, of course, in 1996. We had a lot of blocking around Greenland and going into Scandinavia with the low pressure down to the south and the flow coming through like that regularly from the east. It was a cold spring, especially cold in March and then again in May. May 1996 was a very cold month. Again, I think you can discount these cold years, or very cold years, to some degree, because they are following on from cold winters. 95, 96 was a cold winter, 1979 was a cold winter, 1879 very severe winter, and these years, I think they're just a continuation of the winter pattern rolling on into the spring. So I don't think we can take these years terribly seriously, albeit they are within the pattern, they are options, but I don't think we'll be seeing an extreme cold pattern like we have in some of these years that are showing up. Our penultimate year is 2004. This was an ENSO neutral spring on the warmer side. So again, this might be closer to where we are right now, or where we will be in the spring. This one's showing a very odd looking pattern. We've got ridging up to the northeast, or centre to the northeast, but also extending through the UK and down into the Atlantic. I can't really remember much about the spring of 2004. It doesn't stand out. I think it probably started off quite cold in March 2004, but the rest of it doesn't stand out at all. But I suspect there's probably quite a bit of warm weather in there. It does look like quite a ridgy sort of spring type pattern. And then our final spring is 2006, and this is ENSO neutral on the cooler side. And this one is close to quite a cold pattern. We've got low pressure through to the northeast of the UK and a ridge up around Greenland. I remember this spring quite well because it preceded the very hot summer, of course, of 2006. There's quite a bit of cold weather through March and early April, and then the rest of it, particularly in May, just turned unsettled and wet. No sign at all through the spring of 2006 of the heat that was going to get going through the summer. But I am rather taken with 2006 as an option, because I think the winter, and this did show up when we did the winter updates and the winter analogues, 2005, 2006 was definitely one of the analogues, and I think this winter has come out quite close so far to 2006 in a lot of ways, particularly in terms of how the cold air this winter has tended to congregate in the east and the southeast of Europe. That was something that we saw a lot through the spring, through the winter of 2005, 2006. Now, that doesn't say, just because this winter has been close to 2005, 2006, doesn't mean that the spring will continue to be. But it's interesting that the spring of 2006 is still in there as an option for this spring. So finally, putting all of these years together in terms of the reanalysis, this is what we come out with in terms of all years combined. And overall, it does look like an unsettled spring could be on the way, with a deep trough through the UK and the west of Europe, and some blocking up to the north and to the northeast as well. The jet stream will be going like that with those years. So it looks like quite a cool and quite an unsettled signal where we are in terms of ENSO right now. Looks like quite a cool and unsettled signal for the spring. But we did see, especially some of those years that were ENSO neutral on the warmer side, which is where we're going to be now, I think, or where we will be in spring for this year. Those years that were ENSO neutral on the warmer side, some of them tended to be a little bit more high pressure dominated. So it might not be quite as cold and wet signal as that chart would suggest. Have more analogues for you next month, and also, of course, we're going to have the models coming up as well. So next week, actually next only a week today, we're going to do the second seasonal model roundup for the spring of 2017. It said 2016 then, spring's 2017. And then next month we will do, we'll have some more analogues, and we'll also have the third and final seasonal roundup for the spring. And then at the end of next month, the end of February, we will release BigAsWeatherVids.com Spring. Oh, the camera's just changed colour there. Not sure what happened there. So what was I saying? We will release at the end of February. Sorry about that. Just took me by surprise a little bit. So at the end of next month, we will release the final and official BigAsWeatherVids.com Spring 2017 forecast. And then once that's out of the way, of course, in March, we will start to run on into the summer updates. I know that's what a lot of you are waiting for. A lot of you don't really get that interested by spring. So, only got next month to go. And then we will be off and running with the summer long-range stuff from March onwards. Right, hope you found the video interesting and informative, despite that little surprise that occurred with the camera at the very end. That's it for now. Come back later on when we'll have our eclectic Sunday roundup. That'll be with you from lunchtime, early afternoon. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching.